Now this game is an all-time classic. Ice Hockey on the NES is a simple game, but it's really addictive. And as much fun as it is to play against the computer, it's actually even better as a two-player game. Alright, well, this might not be the most realistic hockey game of all time, however, it is certainly one of the most fun. I've loved playing this game ever since I was a little kid. It's the sort of game that really sucks you in. And of course, it was a huge step above earlier hockey games. I mean, I guess we could count Ice Hockey for the Atari 2600. I mean, this game's kind of fun, but I mean, this is as primitive as you can possibly get. And there are games like Great Ice Hockey on the Sega Master System too, I guess. This game is what it is, which actually is pretty crappy. Yeah, the thing is that the games before Ice Hockey were all pretty bad. I guess it is interesting to note though that this wasn't actually the first hockey game available for the Famicom. There was a different Japanese-only game that beat this one to the punch, and it really sucks. Ah yes, that would be this game, Stick Hunter, which looks like a cooler game than it really is. The best part of this game is the opening title sequence. This game is so slow that it's just incredible. You get creamed from behind by the other team, and then they call the penalty on you for some stupid reason. Fortunately, the same thing happens to the computer, so at least it kind of evens out. And this is what happens when somebody scores a goal. Hey, at least the cheerleaders are fun to watch. Yeah, that one's almost as bad as that Wayne Gretzky game on the NES, which I still think is the worst hockey game of all time, but we'll get to that game a little bit later. Anyway, it was obvious that Nintendo needed to, come out with a good hockey game for a change, and so they came out with one themselves, a game on the Famicom Disk System of all things. Alright, here it is in all of its glory, the Famicom Disk System. It ran old-style discs that looked like this, and the interesting thing is that the copy protection scheme meant reading the I and N letters that are a little bit higher up than the rest. Anyway, when you turn this thing on, you have to wait for it to load like this. So you're probably wondering why in the world Nintendo bothered coming out with the Famicom Disk System, right? Well, I've wondered the same thing myself, and I think that I've actually got an answer. As much as we love the classic Famicom, the truth is that the system was really underpowered even for 1983. So down here is the CPU, the RP2A03G, which was a slightly stripped down version of the old 6502 8-bit microprocessor. This was already old by 1983. The picture processing unit above it was a little bit more powerful, but it was limited. So the problem here is that the Famicom could only read up to 32 kilobytes of program code, or PRG, and up to 8 kilobytes of sprite and picture information, CHR, at the same time. Now, if you go back to 1983 and you look at the sort of games that came out back then, most of the games that were coming out were actually smaller than that. But this did become a really big issue by about 1985. A basic game like Donkey Kong could easily fit on a cartridge with code to spare, sure. And Super Mario Bros. Basically stretched the NES to its natural limit, using up the full 40 kilobytes of space that the system could read. If you're talking about more advanced games like Super Mario Bros. 3, however, you would need a way for the system to be able to read all the extra programming code. This is a problem that was not easy to solve. So there are two different solutions that popped up, and the interesting thing is that both of these solutions came up right around the same time. The first solution, and the one that wound up giving the system a new life, was something that we call a mapper. This is Ninja Jajamaru-kun, a Jalico game that just so happens to be the first Famicom game to use a mapper. You see, cartridges like Donkey Kong were really simple. You had a CHR ROM over here, which speaks to the picture processing unit and tells it what to display. And you have the PRG ROM over here, which contains the actual programming code of the game. Super Mario Bros. Looks exactly the same with just the two chips. Now, if you look at Ninja Jajamaru-kun, you'll notice that there's a bunch of extra stuff. These two things up here wind up being the mapper. So what the mapper does is it tells the system where to look for the code. You see, like I said, the system can only handle a maximum of 32 kilobytes of PRG, or the programming code, and 8 kilobytes of CHR, or the sprites. However, with one of those mappers, you can point the system to a specific part of the code at a specific time, which basically tricks the system into only seeing the code that you want it to see. At least that's my understanding of how it works. So then you can have a PRG that's a lot bigger and the system doesn't know any better. If you've got a better explanation, if you're an engineer, let me know down below. Anyway, Ninja Jajamaru-kun needs the extra help since it's got 16 kilobytes of CHR, which is technically more than the Famicom can handle. Super Mario Bros. 3, meanwhile, has a lot of stuff going on the inside. This includes this SRAM chip up here to help the NES cope with the game's awesomeness. And it has this mapper right here. This is the infamous MMC3 mapper, which was responsible for the most famous games in Famicom and NES and video game history. Anyway, that's one of the solutions they came up with. The other solution was this Famicom disk system, and this solution was a little bit more cumbersome. The nice thing about the Famicom disk system is that it allowed programmers to store a ton more space on the ROM. It came with this black box thing that spoke directly to the Famicom, making sure that it only saw the 32 kilobytes of PRG and 8 kilobytes of CHR that it could handle. The disks, meanwhile, were two-sided and could store 56 kilobytes per side for 112 kilobytes total. That's about 4 times as much as the standard old Famicom cartridge. So the cool thing is that you could also write to the disks. That's the reason why games like Zelda let you save your progress before they figured out how to do that battery pack save. Metroid on the FDS also had the ability to save your game, which a lot of people don't realize because the North American version does not have that. The problem, of course, is that the disk drive would break down like all the time. Now the other problem is that the system limited games to only 8 kilobytes of CHR. In other words, this was actually less powerful than the mapper solution. If you're dealing with like a Super Mario Bros. Clone or something like that, it doesn't really matter. But if you're trying to do something advanced with your graphics, it's kind of nice to have extra space for sprites and other things. And the biggest problem of all is that you had to wait a long time for the games to actually load. So the nice thing about these discs is that they were really cheap, and there were actually these kiosks you could go to in Japan where you could write over your disc with a new game for very, very little money. But technology developed really quickly. By the middle of 1986, there were already Famicom games that took advantage of more ROM space than the Famicom disk system's storage capacity. That's all because of that mapper system, and this is only a couple of months after the FDS first came out. And so it is honestly kind of a mystery to me why in the world Ice Hockey was originally a Famicom disk system game. I mean, it's a cool fact to know, kind of, and it's really not a huge issue when you get used to it. It's just that there's no reason for this game to be a Famicom disk system exclusive. The Ice Hockey ROM takes up 64 kilobytes, which tells me that the game probably fit onto only one side of the disk. I've played through a few entire games of Ice Hockey on the Famicom disk system, and I didn't have to change disk sides even once. It's just a really small game. And the thing is that Nintendo could have made this a cartridge game if it really wanted to. It just didn't. At least it didn't in Japan. But it did in North America, and that's the really odd thing. The cartridge art is seriously iconic. They did a great job with the packaging. The chips themselves, however, look a lot like the ones on that Donkey Kong game that I showed you earlier, don't they? If you're wondering about this chip on the side, well, this is the famous lockout chip, which is required if you want the NES to actually read the game. Anyway, as much fun as it is, Ice Hockey takes up a total of 40 kilobytes, which is the same size as Super Mario Bros., and it doesn't use a mapper at all. And so that goes to show you that you don't need to create like this monster-sized program to make a game that's fun and people want to buy. Sure, there's no like real teams or real players to choose from because that would be data that would take up space. But this is like an arcade-style NES game. This isn't, you know, a massive simulation or whatever. And it's just as much fun as any of the modern hockey video games. In fact, in my opinion, it's more fun. I mean, the gameplay is simple, sure, but it's pretty addictive. The The most brilliant thing is that you can choose the size of your characters before the game starts, which means that there's a whole ton of stuff to experiment with. And it's got one of the cutest fighting systems in the history of hockey games. It's a blast every time you wind up getting into a fight. Well, that's a nice contrast to the blood in the early versions of EA Sports NHL Hockey, eh? Anyway, the game was pretty well received in Japan despite the limitations, and of course it was legendary in North America when it came out here just a couple months later. It received a pretty extensive review in the February 5th, 1988 issue of Biweekly Famitsu. The heading called it the next super game from Nintendo, and there's an explanation over here about what icing means, which I guess is pretty interesting. It's a pretty simple review, including a brief overview of each period during a short sample game. In the end, the magazine gave the game fairly positive reviews, mostly because it's a lot of fun to play. Now, I guess this wasn't a stellar review, but then again, this is a pretty bare-bones arcade-style game, and it was honestly kind of behind the times for 1988. And to tell you the truth, I'm still not entirely sure why this game came out on the Famicom disk system. So Nintendo was working on that famous MM3 mapper at that time. In fact, Super Mario Bros. 3 came out only 8 months after Ice Hockey was first released in Japan. So I kind of wonder what this game could have been if Nintendo had waited a little bit longer and given it the full NES treatment. But it still is a great game as it is, and it's a ton of fun to play. I highly recommend it.